MyKailah, and I am part of the leadership team for WCAP's Climate Change Working Group. I will be the moderator for today's WCAP Climate Change Working Group's webinar series on climate careers. And we hope with this series that we build a stronger sense of how to find and explore careers in climate spaces. The WCAP's Climate Change Working Group mission is to create a space for women of color in climate-related discussions and initiatives. Our goal is to maintain a platform where women of color will build discussions on climate-related issues, in addition to building a network where organizations and experts in the field work hand in hand to share in solutions on how to best save and heal our planet. In our last session, we explored climate-related careers in academia. Today, we will have a third of 4 Climate Career Series webinars, where we hope to share multiple entry points to careers that support and build awareness of climate change issues, as well as build stronger policies and systems to protect our world. During the session, you will see a Q&A box where you can share additional questions, comments, and ideas during the conversation. We will try to address as many questions as possible. Before we start, I am honored to introduce our wonderful speaker, Sonam Velani. Sonam Velani is the CEO of Streetlife Ventures. She was recently former head of global partnerships at Zipline, a startup that designs drones to deliver essential medicines. Previously, she served as the senior advisor to New York City's deputy mayor and oversaw $5 billion of investments to build cutting-edge infrastructure, increase affordable housing, and promote economic developments across the city. Prior to that, Sonam worked at the World Bank and helped finance and implement investments across South Asia. She started a career at Goldman Sachs, where she financed over $10 billion of civic projects, including schools, hospitals, and transportation systems across the U.S. She attended Harvard University and had a bachelor's degree in government economics and visual and environmental studies. She has received the President's Volunteer Service Award, leads the Coaching Fellowship to support young women and Volunteer Service Award, and she volunteers with the Girl Scouts. She founded Empower, a mentorship program for dreamers that helps immigrant and first-gen students to gain admission to top-tier universities. She also works within the AKDN framework to support the city's empowerment initiative. Before we start our conversation, I want to elaborate that climate is a broad and diverse field. You can enter this sector through multiple paths, either STEM, tech, the innovation approach, or policy and international relations background, or even a human rights background. The possibilities are endless. Yet climate as a sector remains a niche and an unconventional career option in many regions. As such, people have to often rely on international and foreign country organizations and offices for jobs. Getting access to information on how to approach this work opportunities and the scope in the field has been a struggle that all of us have faced. Through our Climate Career Series, we wish to make information regarding climate-based careers accessible to people and provide a support system that helps them enter this field of work. Thank you for joining us today, and it's an honor to have you here. Our first question as we begin is, can you tell us more about your journey into the climate space and what led you into the world of investing in infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you, MyKailah. It's awesome to be here and to see so many women and women of color, because there need to be more of us in this space. I can say that as someone who's spent my career in this industry. And, we'll get into sort of the importance of that in a bit, but, I'll start off with my own journey. For me, a lot of this stems from my personal upbringing. I was born in India, in Mumbai, which is one of the largest cities in the world. And I moved to Chicago when I was a young child. My parents basically said, okay, we're going to pack up everything and just go. And we landed in a very cold city of Chicago. My family, didn't have legal status. We were undocumented for basically halfway through college, right? So that over 20 years. And I think that experience made me realize how your physical built environment, the places that you call home, really impact you as a person, and also impact your future potential, frankly, right? So, my parents, they worked all the time. We often lived in, lower income neighborhoods. I remember when it was cold out, we would actually turn on the gas stove for heat sometimes, right? And that's terrible for you. There's actually a report that came out just a few days ago about how bad gas is, particularly for young children. And I think a lot of that sort of lived experience has made me realize that I'm someone who made it, right? And I should use my privilege and my network to pay it forward, right? So that others do not have to live in those conditions. So I was extremely, extremely lucky. I have an incredible supportive infrastructure around me as I was growing up, through my community center, through my religious groups, through my schools, and was, again, extremely lucky, and went to college on a full scholarship at Harvard. And there I studied government economics and what's called visual and environmental studies, right? So it's urban planning for all intents and purposes. And the running joke is that I am still one of the few friends from college who actually uses what we learned, now 15 years ago in our day-to-day. I then went on and worked at Goldman Sachs, building infrastructure and financing things like the Second Avenue subway in New York, or the Chicago Public Schools, which I'm a part of, right? Sort of core infrastructure services, and thinking about creative financing structures so that cities can pay for a lot of this stuff, right? Your water and sewer systems, your transit networks, your schools, things of that sort. I then went to the World Bank and worked with cities primarily in Asia, including Mumbai, where I was born, and sort of worked with governments to figure out how to build infrastructure that doesn't fall apart in the next earthquake or hurricane or other natural disaster. And this is a part of the world that has extreme climate risk, right? You've got the Himalayas up top, which is a lot of earthquake risk and landslides. And then you've got the entire subcontinent of South Asia, which has coastlines that are inundated with cyclones. The country of Bangladesh, for example, about half of the country every single year suffers from these extreme monsoon seasons, right? This year, the country of Pakistan, this past summer, 1/3 of the country was underwater for like months on end, right? So thinking about how can you actually utilize data to improve planning, to improve resiliency, and build stuff that doesn't fall apart, right, when these large events happen. I then came back to New York and worked at City Hall for many years, and was a senior advisor to the deputy mayor. I, again, was incredibly lucky. I got to oversee multi-billion-dollar investments in things like building affordable housing in New York, which is an extremely expensive city, expanding our transportation systems, expanding our city bike network to promote more sustainable forms of transportation, get people out of their cars and into more active forms of transportation. And then I also wrote One NYC, which is New York City's climate action plan. So it's how we as a city are going to get to net zero by 2050. And what are the things that we need to do across our energy systems, across our building systems, transportation networks, food systems, trash systems, to make sure that we reduce emissions and also adapt our city to the reality that we live in. So all of that has now led me to launch Streetlife Ventures. We are a venture studio and a fund. We focus on supporting diverse entrepreneurs, like many of the folks in this room, to build infrastructure and what we call the sustainable hardware of cities, right? So anything related to the built environment or urban infrastructure systems that promotes sustainable and resilient growth. So I'll stop there, but that's a little bit of my story.
Well, we appreciate that. You have a very unique story, especially working in public service and for the government, and then on the entrepreneur side as well. And so, can you tell us about what kinds of skills did you develop to help you in your career journey?
Yeah, I think that this is like a combination of quantitative skills, right? Or what we call hard skills, and then soft skills. And I would actually argue that as you get older in your career, your soft skills dominate. Like you've got to know how to manage people, right? Or else you're not going to get anything done. So I often say that, particularly when talking to women starting off in their careers, right? Or young people starting off in their careers, um, get those technical skills. My first job out of college, I like built Excel spreadsheets. That's basically my job. I built PowerPoint slides, I built Excel spreadsheets. I was taken to client meetings. I was the most junior person on the team, but I worked at a very prestigious organization, right? And I was able to develop a lot of those skills and have training very early on in my career on how to read balance sheets, understanding, how much the New York City subway system costs to operate and what are the specific line items, right, that make our subways go, right? Everything from rail cars to transit signals, to machines that, you swipe your card into or now tap your phone on, right? So there's a lot of that type of hard skills development that is extremely valuable early in your career. And as you grow, I think that then over time shifts to soft skills, right? So over time, you'll progress in your career. You will, go from an analyst to an associate to a vice president, or, you make up your titles, right? Or in my case, you're founder of a company now. And all of that is about managing people, right? It's managing people, it's delegating, it's helping, it's sort of using what's often called your influence, right? And your authority to get things done, and to also develop your teams while you're at it, right? So that they collectively are creating something of value. So yes, I think those sort of two pieces of the puzzle are really important, and they shift over time.
Thank you. That was really great advice. Also, what advice would you have for members of our audience who are students trying to crack into the climate career space? And what sectors do you see the most opportunities?
Yeah, first, I would say that I think it's extremely important to try a lot of things early in your career, right? And I think my own example is probably pretty representative of that. And I think, frankly, the way the world is going. So no longer are we our parents, right? Like people who work in the same job or same industry for 25, 30 years, right? That doesn't happen anymore. And for me personally, I went from a extremely private sector institution, right, where the bottom line really mattered, to an international and development institution. And I got to work around the world. And then I came back and worked in government, right? So I went sort of have this knowledge of how all three systems in our society, right, the financial system and the private sector, the sort of what's often called the nonprofit or international development sector, and then the government, right, how all of these three systems work internally, and then also how they all overlap, right? And so much of my personal career has been able to, I think about connecting the dots between cities, climate change, capital, and community, right? What are the systems we put into place, as a whole, right, that will impact each of these different verticals. And I wouldn't have been able to do that, right? I often talk about, people ask me often about the founder journey, right, and starting your own company. I would not have been able to do that had I not gotten all of these variety of experiences. So go out there, like do a lot of different things, and try to get those experiences under your belt within the first 10 years of your career, where you can build a lot of those different skill sets and experiences. And I think part of that is also creating a narrative arc, right? So I didn't plan to start something, I didn't think that I was going to end up in, at City Hall or anything like that, right? These are all opportunities that came to me as I progressed in my career, and I took advantage of them, right? And I think that is part and parcel of being flexible and nimble, like having some sort of path and like, defining your interests, but then sort of thinking through, at which point you want to make those shifts. I'll also say one other piece about career development here, right? After City Hall, I left and I joined a company called Zipline. It's an incredible company. We use drones to deliver life-saving medicine, right? People who are may have been in a bus accident and need blood, right? And they live in Rwanda where the roads just aren't that great, right? So you can't transport things in a fast manner. And it's it's an amazing product, an amazing company, does great work. But I very quickly realized that just healthcare is just not my thing, right? It often goes into a part of my brain that has been like someone else's problem to solve, not my problem to solve. And I was saying this in the middle of a pandemic, right? When like it's everyone's thing. Healthcare is everyone's thing. So it is also okay to make those types of changes, and you'll learn what you like about your job and what you don't like. And it's okay to have those blips. So that's a bit on the career side. And then on the sort of sector side, I've always been fascinated by cities, right? I've talked about my own story. I used to take public transit to school every day. And I even wrote my college admissions essay about taking the train to and from school, and sort of all the quirky people that you meet on the subway. And I think, the physical spaces that we call home really define who we become. And there's a lot of opportunity to define, what that looks like, right? And what our cities will look like over time. So one stat that I give in almost every talk that I do is that 75% of the urban infrastructure of 2050 is yet to be built, right? So there are places around the world, in the United States and in the sort of Western developed world, we are retrofitting everything that we have, right? We're trying to like figure out how to fix our bridges and our tunnels and our transportation systems. In the developing world, right, a lot of this infrastructure is just coming online. And these are places that are growing incredibly quickly. In 2022, in November, just a few months ago, the world hit 8 billion people. It's going to hit over 10 billion people in the next 30 years. Like, where are we going to put all these folks, right? We've got to build roads. We've got to build bike lanes. We've got to build housing. We've got to build energy systems. We've got to build transmission lines and a whole host of other things to accommodate that growth. And I think we as policymakers, as entrepreneurs, as people in this industry today have a lot of say of what our world will look like in the next 30 years, but also anything that you put into the ground today is going to last another 300 years, right? So there's a huge amount of opportunity to shape both that discourse and the physical investments that are ultimately made.
Wow, as a current grad student right now, that advice and the point you made, basically I took from is how to be like adaptable and flexible in your career. You don't have to have everything planned out and know everything. So that was really helpful, and I'm sure it's helpful to other college students or anyone else in the career field, especially looking into climate change. My next question is infrastructure one of the spaces that we should consider a place for opportunity for career growth, which you've already pretty much touched on that. And so I'll make another transition into how does urban planning offer opportunities to bring more diversity into the workplace? And what do you envision to be the future of this sector?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, as a woman, as a person of color, and I think many of you will resonate, right? We don't always have it easy. I will be the first to say that, right? There have been many, many times where I'm the only woman in the room, particularly in the infrastructure space, oftentimes the youngest person in the room, right? And I think, to what I was saying earlier on people management, how do you influence without authority, right? They're not necessarily people who are directly reporting to me, but it's my job to get a big project done, right? Because I sit at City Hall and I have to make sure that all of the agencies within this city government kind of, row in one direction. So I think that has, the people management skills really comes into play here. But, just some stats around climate change and particularly how it impacts women. About 80% of the people displaced by climate change are women. That said, if you look at national governments around the world, only about 20% of seats are held by women, right? People who are making the laws and policies of what our world will look like. Less than 3% of venture capital for early stage companies goes to women. And I often say, right, if we're going to get out of this mess that we are currently in, 50-50 parity is what's going to get us out of it, right? So it is incredibly important that we as a gender and as a people stand up for ourselves, be seen and be heard. If you are a woman who has made it, there's a lot of saying of, bring, open the door, bring chairs around the table, right? I remember when I was younger in my career, I used to sit, go to all these big meetings, and I'd be the youngest person, sometimes the only woman. And I would sit in sort of the back of the table. And I remember in my first job, there were several senior women on my team who would make sure that they would bring up the chair, they would make everybody move around and create some space so that I could sit at the table, right? If I was giving, if I had done the presentation, I probably stayed up till 2 a.m, making the Excel sheets and the PowerPoint slides, right? They actually gave me the chance to actually present, right? And speak about what the consequences might be about a bond offering or a specific financial structure. And I am so grateful for that, because for me, it's learning opportunities, but it's also people looking out for me, right? And now that I'm in a position to do that myself for folks coming up behind me, it's something that it's sort of an opportunity that I don't take for granted. So I think, make yourself known, right? Be present is really important. And I think women in particular, right? If we're going to change all these numbers, like the world is what it is because a whole bunch of, no offense, like a bunch of white men used to control money and power and physical places for literally centuries, right? And now the tide is finally turning. So how can we sort of collectively work together to make sure that what we are building today is better for future generations, right? And I think that's part and parcel of it. Some other things I think that there on the climate front in particular, right? There's been a huge explosion of interest in this industry. I think the sky turned orange in San Francisco in 2020, and people were like, oh, wow, there's climate change, right? People's like light bulbs went off. And obviously a lot of the disparities in our society really, really came to light during COVID, right? And I will say that it is like, as someone who's spent the better part of my career in this space, it is awesome to see so much interest. Last year in 2022, there was about $70 billion of venture capital went into this industry, right, to support early stage innovations in climate. It's now 30% of the overall venture capital streams, right? Where, there's talk about a recession. It's like climate is one of the few industries that actually not impacted, right? Because you have what I call the age of climate industrialism, right? So we as a society have finally acknowledged that this is a problem, and instead of being completely reactive, we're starting to be proactive in how we address these issues. So you have things like the infrastructure bill in the United States, which is $1 trillion to fix our roads and our bridges and whatnot. We have the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is almost $400 billion of investments in things like tax credits for electric vehicles, or putting heat pumps into your homes, or adapting sort of physical infrastructure to the realities of climate change. And then you also have this huge talent transfer, right? There's like, I'm sure the people have seen some of the headlines around, some of the layoffs that are happening right now in the tech industry or in finance. And the reality is that like climate tech is hiring, and it's hiring a lot, right? Like almost every company I touch is like, oh, do you know people who want a job, right? So there's a lot of opportunity because we are literally going to be creating millions of jobs as we put in wind turbines, as we put in solar panels, as we develop new transmission lines, as we need electricians to fix our HVAC systems. So there's huge opportunity and growth in this field.
Yes, and that's also, I think, it's a way of a lot of innovation, bringing in. So a lot of people who are creative or innovative would be great in the climate sector.
Exactly.
If you could look into the future, what are some niche areas that you would recommend our audience to look further into? Which I said you kind of elaborated on these anyways. Like I said, the climate sector, which you said is bringing in multiple jobs, and we talked about innovation. And so that was our pretty much final question.
Yeah, I think that so climate change is two pieces of the same coin, right? There's two sides of the same coin. It is, one side is mitigation. So we as a society emit a gajillion, a lot of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And we've basically got to get that down to zero by 2050 if we have any hope of like real survival, right? So there's going to be a ton of investment in that over the next 30 years, and a lot of that has already started. But a lot of these targets are for 2050, right? And I often say climate change is here and now. Right? There's atmospheric rivers in California at the moment. I live in New York City. It's like literally 60 degrees outside on January 13th, right? It is, there are like significant changes in weather patterns that are frankly really disturbing and impact people today and not all the way in 2049. But there's a big mismatch in funding, right? So if you look at climate finance flows, about 93% of climate finance goes into mitigation, only 7% goes into adaptation. Adaptation is dealing with the here and now. I talked about some of the venture capital stats earlier, right, in terms of early stage innovation. A lot of that is going into things like energy, electric vehicles. It's going into energy systems, particularly battery innovation and battery storage. It's going into a little bit into food and agriculture, right? But things like the built environment, right, or urban systems, they account for about 17% of our GHG emissions. Less than 4% of VC goes into the built environment sector, right? So you have these huge gaps in terms of where the money goes versus what the needs are. So I'd say adaptation is a big one, right? I don't need another software tool to tell me where it's going to flood in New York City. It literally, the water goes to the same places as it has been for the last 300 years. It just happens to be that we built over all these places, right? We built over watersheds. But what you do need is things like porous concrete, which is a material science innovation, right? So that when it does rain, the water can seep into the groundwater resources, right? Can seep into the soil and sort of these like, sort of cisterns and holding containers and all sorts of other things. You need things like green roofs, right? When you have urban heat island effects and it's 100 degrees in the middle of summer, having greenery on your rooftops, making sure that they're not concrete, having tree-lined streets, right? Low-hanging fruit, not super expensive. All of that stuff really, really makes a difference. And I think that there is plenty of opportunity and innovation in this space. The other thing that I would say as someone who's, works on cities and particularly around climate and capital to cities, city governments globally spend about $380 billion per year on climate action, right? This is everything from like recycled asphalt for your roads to enlarging your sewer systems to accommodate sort of increased rainfall events. to putting up solar on public schools, right? They spend a ton of money. And I think a lot of people in sort of the venture capital industry and the finance industry don't recognize that opportunity. So, we at Streetlife, we focus a lot on partnerships with cities and partnerships with infrastructure agencies as our bread and butter, because that's where we think we can make the most impact. And I'd say some, those are the areas, right? Things related to adaptation, nature-based solutions, the built environment, where a lot more innovation needs to happen. And capital is like starting to flow into this space.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing such wonderful insights on approaching a career in climate change through the lens of infrastructure. I think one of the biggest takeaways that I personally got from this, especially it's just having a positive outlook, especially in climate change and climate career sectors. A lot of times I'm from Alabama, and so we don't hear a lot of this information. And, in some parts of the world, and even in the United States, climate is not on the forefront of discussion. But as women of color, especially, marginalized groups, I think we can spearhead this and we can start these discussions and we can partner with each other, and especially in these spaces, and bring this information and share strategies that, partnership together to bring this issue to the forefront, and innovative ideas and anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And again, kind of what I was saying earlier, right? We're all in it together, right? This one planet is literally, climate change does not know borders. I remember I was at COP27 earlier, or last year now, I guess, in November, in Egypt. And, this is this like giant climate change conference. It's people from all over the world, and each country has a pavilion. And the country of Pakistan, their pavilion, literally the headline was, "What goes on in Pakistan does not stay in Pakistan," right? And that really resonated with me, because here's a country that's like literally still underwater, right, from flooding earlier this summer. And they're saying to the world that we are not the only ones, right? And I was just looking at some of the photos from, and videos from California this week, and, entire communities are underwater at the moment, right? So really there are no borders. It's the unfortunate thing is that communities that are lower income and often more diverse communities are impacted more negatively, right? Because when we think about, again, financial flows, they tend to go to richer areas. I do think that we are finally at a moment in time where some of that is changing. You have, I talked about the infrastructure bill and the IRA. The federal government has a sort of mandate or a goal that says, it's called Justice 40, such that 40% of all of these investments will go into underserved communities, which I think is massive, right? This is like billions and billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that's going to go into these communities. And I think, again, the tide is changing. But yeah, we all got to work together to get there.
With everything that's been spoken about, we have received many questions, comments, and insights from our audience, which I'm sure we would love to hear your insights upon. With that, let's turn to our first question for discussion. When it comes to the public versus private sector, where do you think it makes the most sense to start from a career point of view, as well as the best way to make an impact?
Yeah, I think this comes back to my point around like getting skills, right? And quantitative skills in particular. I started my career in the private sector. Every single job that I've had since then has been through people that I've built in my network from Goldman, right? And I think that has really helped me progress, because people see that basically you know how to do math, right? But people see that you've got technical skills, and you can apply those technical skills to a variety of different issues. So I often advise people, it's great to start in the private sector and then move to the public sector, because it's much easier to shift that way than the other way around. The other thing, I'm just going to be real, right? Like, not all of us come from money. I think that's especially true for women and people of color. And the reality of wealth and wealth transfer and wealth generation is that you need money to make money, right? So I started my career and did make a lot of money when I was early in my career, right? And that has then given me, frankly, the luxury, right, and the optionality to go on and do things where I have, it's okay that I got a pay cut, right? Because I have savings, I have, a comfortable level of sort of funding in my back pocket, right, there where I can take risks. And I think that we as a community, women in particular, right, people of color, we don't talk about money. It is like taboo and kind of seen as a private thing, but I think we need to be much more open about what that means and how your career choices can impact your wealth generation capacity over the course of your lifetime, right? If you start investing when you're 22 or 24 or 25, instead of when you're 35, you've got 10 years of accumulated cash, right? At, say you have, market returns are 6-7% a year. That's thousands of dollars, right? Over the course of your life, it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, right? So I think those are all things that that you've got to consider. Obviously, everybody has their own story and sort of the, different sort of take on this, but that's something that that I think is really, really important to discuss, in addition to the technical skills that you build in the private sector and the training that you receive in the private sector.
We may need to have you for a part two, because I think that is some advice that we really need to keep talking about women, especially marginalized women or women of color, and conversations around money and how sometimes uncomfortable that can be, or how much we, is not as explained from the areas we grew up in.
I will add one more thing to that. A lot of people ask me like, oh, how did you get into finance and this, that, and the other, right? And it's like, I didn't know anything about this stuff, right? Like my parents, like many people in this room, right? They come from working class backgrounds, like they've never invested or anything like that. And I remember when I was in college, it was we have this Office of Career Services, right? So you have to like drop your resume for all these companies, for full-time jobs. And I remember my resume was due the day Lehman Brothers collapsed in September of 2008. And I was like, okay, that's it, right? Like none of us are going to get jobs. But it was then that I actually started, like, that summer, as there were all these shifts in the financial markets, I started listening to Bloomberg radio. And back then, I would have to, get my corded headphones and sort of stick them into my computer and whatnot, right? But now they have an app, and I'm going to pull it up because I think it's important to show. It's just the Bloomberg app, and you just click on the media section and audio, and you can listen to, you can just press play. And I actually still, to this day, listen to Bloomberg radio as I'm working, right? Because it's just a way for me to know what's going on in the world. It's a way for me to know what's going on in the markets. And it's a great, great way to just learn about finance, right? Global events, investments, things like that, things that you might not otherwise have exposure to, right? And again, it's as simple as just like listening to the radio.
Thank you. That's great, especially insight for me. I mean, I've been kind of steering away from that, so that I needed that to be a little bit more courageous and to get into finance and understanding, especially with international political economy and everything like that. So I appreciate that. Can you say a bit more about how you shifted from international to the domestic space? That's our second question. And was it easy to make these shifts?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think for me, when I was working on the international side, it was incredible, right? I traveled the world. I got to like see and do a lot of different things that someone my age, like from my background, like really wouldn't have experienced. I think one thing I quickly realized was that I would go to India all the time for work, right? To like the middle of nowhere places. And I speak the language, I'm sort of very close to the culture. But what came back to me over and over again was that, like, yes, there is abject poverty in places like India and, many parts of the world, but these are not problems that resonate with me, right? What resonates with me is growing up in inner city Chicago, right? It's growing up in a very diverse culture, but a very lopsided view of the income stratum, right? And those were the problems that I felt closest to, and where I thought that my own lived experience could make an impact. And I think that's just something that you've got to try to to see where you fall on that spectrum. I do think that there is incredible opportunity in the international space. And I think, again, to my point of doing a lot of different things early in your career, because I've done that, now Streetlife is a global firm, right? We can work with cities around the world on doing this type of stuff. We have knowledge of, what it takes to implement something in a developing market, in a developed market. What are the political nuances? What are the economic nuances? So I think that's important, but it is, it's not too difficult to switch back and forth. When you're thinking about your careers, you want to think like there are usually three things that you can change. You can change your geography, you can change your function, and you can change your industry, right? And when you're making career shifts, you usually don't want to change all three at once, right? Because that's a really difficult shift. But you can certainly start with changing one thing, right? And then in the next career step, you can change the next thing, right? So say you're working in international development and you're working on, I'm making this up, right? Energy infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa, right? What solar panels are, right? What the deployment looks like, what transmission lines look like. If you want to come back to the United States, you can still work in that same field, but you're changing your geography, and you'll learn a little bit more about this geography here. So that's kind of my take on how to think about these things.
In a way, to kind of add to that question, I remember earlier in the conversation where you talked about noticing connections and seeing connections. And I was wondering with that, did that make it easier for you to shift into different careers because you were able to see how things flowed together and notice certain things coming together or patterns?
Yeah, exactly, right. I often say it's about connecting the dots, right? And I think for me, that was certainly the case. Because a very good example right now is, something very live that's happening in India and in Africa, right? You've got these huge sort of shifts, right? People are coming into the middle class. There are, people have more disposable income. People are like buying cars, right? People are buying mopeds, things like that. And there's a company in India called Bolt. And it's one of the largest electric vehicle battery swapping companies, right? Because they're like, well, people don't have time to sit around and like wait until their cars are charged, right? So why not create a system where you create mopeds, you create much smaller vehicles, right? And you can just swap batteries. So you put, you go what is effectively, the next generation of a gas station. You go there, you take the battery out of your car, swap, put it into the machine where it charges, and then you take a fully charged battery and put it into your car, right? Or put it onto your moped. I think that type of innovation is stuff that needs to come to America, right? But this is like places in other parts of the world have leapfrogged, or there's a term called leapfrog, right? They basically like skipped a lot of that product like R&D process. So it's seeing patterns like that over time and across geographies. It's great. And then the other thing is, related to connections is never stop networking, right? Anybody you meet can be helpful to you, or you can be helpful to them at some point in your career. And you graduate from college when you're like 22, and you're probably going to work until you're 72, right? Like that is 50 years to do a lot of different things, to meet a lot of different people. And I do tons of career chats, right? People reach out to me all the time, can I have 30 minutes to chat? And I often say yes, right? But I would say that, 7 out of 10 people don't follow up with me 6 months later to tell me how they're doing, right? And And then I often have instances where somebody comes out of the blue 5 years later, right? And I have no idea who they are. I can't remember on the chat, the 20, 30-minute conversation that we had. So part of networking is building those relationships over time and building those connections over time, right? If you and I are chatting, I say something, I introduce you to someone, keep me updated, right? How did that conversation go? Check in with me 6 months later, say hi, tell me what you're up to, right? That is something that people forget, and it's a life skill that goes an extremely long way. So that's part of the, connecting the dots.
Thank you so much for this. Our third question would be, would you recommend doing an internship to break into the industry, or is an entry-level position possible to attain after your studies?
Yeah, you should absolutely do internships. Like internships give you a lot of those technical skills, but they also give you soft skills, right? When I was 18, like I didn't know how to talk to adults, right? I didn't know how to present my work, right? So a lot of the internships that I did like really helped me develop those skills, right? And especially again, coming from a family, a community where like my parents never worked in an office, right? I was just not exposed to that. So I think that internships are really important to hone that craft, in addition to learning a lot, right? So I would even suggest like many smaller companies will do internships. Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Multiple people using multiple headphones that are all connected to Apple. I got a little notification. But the internship route is extremely important, even when you're in high school, right? You can work on side projects. Some might be paid, some might be unpaid, but you'll get a lot of skills. There are also programs that are specifically for women and minorities in the climate careers that are important to just learn about, right, and get your names on, get on those mailing lists. And as we finish up, I'm actually going to put a whole bunch of resources into the chat, so that you all have these as well. EDICT is an internship program for diversity and climate, right? Because if we're starting a new industry, like it can't look like finance and healthcare and law and sort of all the other industries that have, no women in leadership positions or no people of color in leadership positions, right? Climate tech is a new industry. And this transition is across our economy, right? So let's get it right from the start, not only in what we're building, but who is building this stuff and what are the experiences that they're bringing to the table. So Elemental is one. I have a list of sort of resources that I often direct people to. And then a few months ago, a friend of mine just put them all into a website. So I'm going to send you his website called Climate Tech Careers. To the point on climate adaptation versus resilience. We have, as a part of Streetlife, we have a creative storytelling platform called Parachute, where we go to different cities around the world and we talk about climate solutions in these cities, right? What works, what doesn't, and why. And it's sort of this database and long form narrative on, just creative things that different communities are implementing. And then if any of you are in New York, I also run what's called the New York Climate Tech Ecosystem. We started as we started literally as an 8-person dinner. We're about 2,500 people now over the past year, right? And it's growing very quickly, right? Because there's so much interest in this space. So here I often write about different, different climate climate communities and policy and how that ties into climate tech and climate infrastructure as well. And this is an example of something that just grew organically, right? A bunch of us got together for dinner, and then two of us were like, oh, we should do this on a regular basis. And now it's a huge group, right? So I think these are all we're actually expanding into new cities. So even if you're not in New York, if you're in another city and you want to start like a new chapter, you can always reach out. But these are all sort of ways to get involved. And build your own network and your own ecosystem.
As women, we tend to be more.
Somebody on here also shared a Google Doc of resources started by Nicole. Nicole is like a dear friend of mine. Here in New York, she's an amazing climate watercolor artist, and she has a huge Twitter following. So a few weeks ago, she was like, what things should I direct people towards? And then this is like now this massive crowdsourced database of resources, which is incredible.
Thank you again for sharing those resources. And we have one fourth and final question, and it would be, as women, we tend to be more timid when it comes to taking risks. I deeply admire your ability to shift your career in so many different ways. What gave you the courage to make these shifts?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is a bunch of different things, right? It is the financial stability, right? I would say is the number one thing that's important, right? It's something that is again, as a woman, as someone who contributes to my family, as many of us do, right? This is something that was like top and center for me, right? Can I make sure that I have enough money saved over to take care of my parents, to take care of my children, right? Like all of those things really matter, which is why I think we need to talk about it a lot more. The second is, I think, having the confidence and courage in yourself, right? Like you are your biggest advocate. It's awesome that all these women have pulled up chairs for me and supported me along the way. But if I can't stand up for myself, like a lot of that help won't get me anywhere, right? So I think having the confidence in yourself is really important. And sometimes that just takes time to build, right? And it's through your own sort of experiences, getting involved in a lot of things that really help. I also have done an executive coaching program. I'm putting the link in here. It's called the Women's Impact Alliance. It's free. And it's for women in social impact careers. And it's this incredible leadership development program that I now did, several years ago. And I'm still very involved in the community. And it gives you some of those like life skills, right? About tactically, how do you speak up for yourself, right? How do you sort of build that courage and that confidence? So I think those are all the things that really, really helped me, right? Like you're your biggest advocate and you've got to take a chance on yourself.
I agree. I think throughout the talk, you've talked about soft power, and then now you're ending with talking about having, faith and confidence in yourself. And I think those are extreme and valuable tools, especially for women of color to have if they want to advance, especially in the climate sector. And so thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. Hopefully, this is just the start of the conversation, and we hope to continue to keep taking it forward to cover as many sectors and areas of work that we can. Today was such a treat for me, and as I hope it was for you that are all watching.